Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this video today. I had just started interviewing some of the amazing trainers and teachers I have worked with, and today we have a very special guest with us. I got introduced to him through one of our business partners, one of the HRs whom I have worked with. And this gentleman here is one of the most welcoming, warm personalities that I have come across. Uh, when I got to know him, we had a very brief conversation and we exchanged numbers, and later we connected. And I wanted to know how I can get better at this beautiful art of training. And he was kind enough to spend almost 40 minutes over a phone call to tell me what I could do to get better at this wonderful field. He is someone who enjoys facilitating leadership and communication skills training. He is also involved in coaching, and he has 21 years of experience in the field of learning and development. And he is an MBA graduate from the Lancaster University in the UK. For the last 16 years, he has been working at Momentum Training Solutions. Currently, he is the director of this wonderful firm. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Vikas. Thank you so much for joining us today, Vikas.
Balaji, thank you for reciprocating the warm welcome. And I just learned today that it was 40 minutes we spent on the conversation. So I never realized it was, which means you're a good conversationalist. The conversation was engaging the other day. But thank you for very kindly introducing me. And it, personally, for me, like you said, it's an art, facilitation, and it's an art that I've spent time honing and learning. And it is always my pleasure to give back to the community of facilitators, trainers, coaches who uh, come into this profession with the intent of serving others. So I think that's something that I've always enjoyed doing. So it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It really means a lot. Well, so could you tell us today? I really wanted to talk in this session about feedback. And
Mm-hmm.
could you, a lot of trainers do understand that we should not make the participant feel bad or offended when we give the feedback. What would be the way to do it effectively in a way that they don't feel offended, but the purpose is met?
Yeah. Um, I think the answer may be cliched, but I think the approach to it is something that most of us find challenging. So we all talk about what we call honest feedback, right? I think my answer is going to be it's about honest feedback. And the challenge that I think most of us face is really around what is honesty, what is diplomacy, and what is brutal honesty, right? Because I think when we cross that line into brutal honesty, we tend to probably create a lot of ripples in the mind of the receiver, and that can put up their defensive walls. So that's one risk we take. But on the other hand, if we choose the path of diplomacy, we could end up being so subtle that the person may not really get what they need. And I think this is a fine line as we walk it. So there's no one best way to do it, but I go back to around 2007, 2008, when I first joined Momentum Training Solutions. I'll tell you a little backstory here. I was working with Pramila Matthew, who was one of the founding members of the organization, highly seasoned facilitator herself. And I saw her being quite candid in her feedback with participants. And I asked her a very similar question. Is it okay to be that candid with participants when they feel a little hurt sometimes? And her answer was interesting for me. She said, yes, it may, but as a facilitator, I'm constantly having to make this choice of whether I want to appease them or really come here to perform the purpose that I was supposed to, which is to enable their growth. And as long as the feedback is given with the intention of enabling growth, I think people will see through it and see the purity of intent behind it. And if they do that, then they will grow from it. And if they choose not to see it, then that's tough for them. Maybe they might realize that later, or maybe you were just meant to be a messenger in that moment, right? And then I said, well, it's when you're working as a training consultant, if the participants maybe don't like some of that feedback, could it cause for them to put slightly lesser ratings on the feedback form at the end of the day, which HR takes note of, and that could lead to further business as well. And she said something very interesting. She said that sometimes we like to be liked. And this happens not only for us as facilitators, even for business leaders who I coach today. Some of them tend not to give that candid feedback because we like to be liked. And we've got to rise above that sometimes and say, how can we be more real? And how can we choose to give feedback with using a choice of words that is meant to be respectful to the other person, and yet not so subtle that they can't catch it. So this is so she said that in the past, there have been instances where people have said that they've not liked a session because of some of the candidness of the nature of the feedback. But those were few and far between, maybe 2 or 3 people, and usually a little later on, either in the same day or sometimes we do long-term programs. So in the long-term program, maybe by session 5 or 6, then they understand that the feedback was given with the right intent. So I think my answer to that would be, let's be candid in the way we share that feedback. As facilitators, our primary role is really to be observant, and we have to call it as we see it. And the difficulty for us sometimes is removing our own judgment from it, right? So using words like good or bad is really our judgment of it. But to say that, hey, this was your behavior, and this is how it could be perceived. And to say, and if that continues, this could be the impact for you and for others around you. And if we do that with honesty, with love, as much as it might be tough love, I think people will see through it and value it and respect it. So that, for me, is how I would go about and how I have gone about giving feedback. Hey, Balaji, you're on mute, my friend. I know you're speaking, but
I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you so much. That I particularly wanted to ask you about feedback because of the feedback I got from one of the trainers who attended the Train the Trainer program that you conducted. And the trainer said that the feedback was extremely useful. The session was really helpful in helping her to get better.
I'm glad to hear that.
So how you said that you mentioned that this is what you say this is your behavior currently, and this is how it can affect, and if you change this, then it might, it would work for you. Is there any other method that you use when it comes to giving feedback other than this particular approach?
I'll be candid with you, Balaji. When I first started out, the sandwich was my go-to. I often think of the sandwich methodology, where you put, the 2 bread slices and the filling in between. So the breads represent the positives, and the filling represents the areas of growth. And of course, today you have the SBI model, which is situation, behavior, impact. You have the GROW model, which is about goals, reality, options, and will, which is a lot more in coaching. But to be very honest, there is no particular model that I use. I think I started with the sandwich and later realized that I think the sandwich model is very good as a model for a beginner because it's like when you learn to ride a bicycle, these are like support wheels and allow you to learn to balance. But I think once you learn to ride a bicycle, it's important also to remove those support wheels. Otherwise, our mind becomes a little dependent on them. And I think that people when they receive sandwich feedback today, are a lot more cognizant of it. And sometimes when you start with the positive, the recipient's mind is already thinking, okay, yeah, but, and so they're waiting for the area of growth. So I think that model has been tried, tested, and I think would work great for beginners. As I mentioned, some of the other models, I love using Grow, especially when I coach. But to be truthful, I don't like to stay dogmatic to any particular model. For me, it's really about calling it in the moment. Sometimes I might hear a person say something and I might just say, hey, why did you say that? And this is how I perceived it. And is this how it pans out with other conversations of yours? Or sometimes I might be watching a person make a presentation and I might say, I mean, my heart wants to go out and tell them, hey, these are all the wonderful things you did, and this is the area of growth. But then they might have made, an effort really well, but the impact was kind of lost because the message was not clear. In those cases, sometimes I have to be candid and say, the message was just not clear for me. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cough. So yeah, there's no particular model, but yeah, these are some of the ways that I've been helped in the past.
Great. Thank you so much for letting us know about some of the methods that you have followed. And yes, at the end of the day, what matters is has it helped them or not, more than whether we have been very sweet about the giving that feedback. So, and now I would like to talk about how should trainers take feedback. So from whom should they take feedback? And I would really like it to hear from you in terms of how you have taken feedback about your facilitation. Have you invited some senior trainers to give feedback? Or we do get feedback from the participants, but then the professional approach to implementing or meeting their requirements, I think that can come from someone in the field. So could you tell us about it?
Balaji, very good question. And this is a challenging one to answer. I'll be candid with you. The way I've received feedback in the past is obviously through peers or colleagues who maybe observed my work and given me feedback. But I'll be honest with you today, I think it's a lot more through self-observation. And I think one of the best methodologies for a facilitator to use would be recording oneself whenever it is allowed, obviously without recording participants and their conversations. And self-analyzing. It's almost like if you're a sports person, you analyze whatever you're doing on the field to see if you can do that better. But unlike sports people, you don't sometimes play a team game or a televised event. So you don't get that opportunity so often. And so if you have an opportunity for another facilitator to observe you, I would say take every chance to do so. But I also know those opportunities are few and far between. I still remember in my first job, we used to co-facilitate. So there were two trainers to a room, and I think that's one of the best methodologies you can have. And in those cases, yes, we did give feedback to each other after a point in time. But most of the feedback I received in my formative years were either through my colleagues or my mentor, Pramila Matthew, I mentioned a little earlier, who sometimes I've co-facilitated with. And nowadays, let's say if you're doing a team bonding session or programs where you have multiple participants where you can co-facilitate, my colleagues do give me some feedback from time to time, and I solicit that from them too. But beyond that, I think it's just through self-observation, through observation of others. What I do a lot today is, I wouldn't say this about feedback per se, but learning the art of facilitation. I love watching some of them in the public domain. I think since the pandemic, a lot of facilitators have gone online and made videos. So I watch some of that. I watch TED Talks. I watch Toastmasters. I watch facilitators who are world-renowned speakers, whether they're Tony Robbins or some Vishen Lakiani from Mind Valley and a few others. who are in the personal growth space as well. So watching them, learning from them is always an interesting part. And then you try and see, hey, I like this that I saw in that video. Maybe I can take that part and take a little bit of this. So to be honest, I think my style today is an amalgamation of all the wonderful styles I've managed to see over the years. And even from a young age, I remember observing Mr. Amitabh Bachchan. And I'm fairly sure he doesn't know me too much, but but I do, I'm grateful for him as well, because I've learned a lot by watching not just his movies, but to watch something like the way he conducts himself in an interview, the way he articulates his thought process, the way he uses his voice. I think there's so much we can learn from these different personalities. I like to watch influencers such as someone like a Barack Obama and his body language, and the Steve Jobs and his presentation style, to Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam and his storytelling abilities as a speaker is just fabulous. To the wit of Shah Rukh Khan, to the poise of an R. Madhavan, who's one of our South Indian actors, when he speaks at a university. I think there's so much we can learn from some of these public figures and try and see, okay, how can we make that a part of us? Not just imitate that, but just also ingrain some of that into our natural style and discover our own. So it's a process of constantly working on it, but that's another way that I have discovered through observing others. But yes, if I talk about feedback, jump at every chance to take it, self-observe a lot, and observe others. Those are the three things that I would say to this.
Wonderful. There are plenty of things I got from this answer. Self-observe and observe others. When you explain that you learn from TED Talks, you learn from Toastmasters, you learn from so many other people you observe, I felt like every minute can be a learning experience. So I think that's what you are doing. That's what I could see. And you mentioned that this is like a constant process. There is no deadline to that, or there's no end to this kind of learning. You when you mentioned about Toastmasters, I think that's one platform that tells us that you have to keep on learning. There is no end to that. Have Could you tell us a little bit about you know when you are inspired by somebody, uh, and you want to be like them? So there is one of the pronunciation trainers. His name is Adrian Underhill. I am very much impressed by that gentleman. But then, how do I make sure that I'm not actually imitating that person, but I am learning from him, and as time progresses, I'm developing my own style. How do we uh, go about this?
Balaji, I said when giving feedback, we have to be real. And so when giving my answers, I would like to be real as well.
Yes.
And truth of it is, we will end up imitating that person. And truth of it also is, imitation is one of the greatest forms of flattery. And what I've discovered is in the beginning of my career, there were a couple of people who I used to observe and I used to really feel are, who I would say, good in their fields. And later on, I realized that I'm probably imitating them a little bit. So, and that's the only time you can change, because some of this imitation is almost subconscious. You don't even realize it. And the moment you realize it, and that's when the awakening happens, and then you consciously make a shift to say, okay, I realize I'm kind of becoming this individual, right? Or a cheap imitation sometimes, I'll be honest with myself, right? The original is always the original. And that's when the realization sets in, that you make this conscious shift to say, okay, how do I do a little bit differently? And discovering your natural style is an evolutionary process. And truth be told, your natural style also changes over time. I can look back and answer this question and say, hey, no. But when I started out in training, I was in my early 20s. So it's a very impressionable age. And emotional maturity, while it was there, I think grew over the years. So for me, it was a process of just actually jumping in, trying a few things out, and then learning along the way that this is that person's style. Whether it be Amitabh Bachchan or Steve Jobs or Barack Obama or Dr. Kalam and any of the names I mentioned, as much as I try to pick out a few things, then sometimes I would get into that particular style for some time, and I'd have to consciously extricate myself from that style. But the beauty of doing that is because when you do something repetitively is when it becomes habit, and when it becomes habit, it ingrains into your style. So getting into that habit of doing things a certain way was great for me, because today who I am is an amalgamation of different styles that I've seen over the years, and I've modified into my own way of doing it. But at the same time, also being able to see the forest from the trees and say, hey, you know what, I'm recognizing this is actually not me. This is somebody else's style, and I've got to be careful about this. That realization, that awareness, when it comes in, that's the moment to actually shift. And sometimes this awareness doesn't come in because it's happening for you subconsciously. This is where self-observation actually helps. If you're recording yourself, you get to see yourself from outside of you. And when you see that, this process of being able to recognize it, become aware of it, extricating yourself from that style will become faster. It's a faster learning cycle, a faster learning loop. So that's something that I would say helped me in the past, and I hope can help others.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry. Could you tell us about what has been the toughest part for you in this 21 years of being a part of learning and development? As a trainer, what is the biggest challenge that you have faced?
Wow, this is this is a tough question for me to answer now. Maybe this one, huh? No. Well, I'd say there are, of course, multiple challenges that we face along the journey. I can't put it to a particular instant, but I think that to me, one of the toughest challenges really would be when we are asked, either by sometimes clients or participants, to deliver a particular outcome in terms of a learning program, whether it's communication or leadership and so on. And they say, well, I can't take my participants out of their jobs for more than 2 hours. So I'd like you to run a 2-hour session for them and achieve this. So they give you a really, really short time frame and have tall expectations, and they hope that participants will learn from it. I often compare that to what they say is the golden triangle of project management: cost, quality, and time. Getting all three to go in synchronicity together is quite a challenging task. So why I'm saying that to you is, and I'm also saying that people will say, we'll give you this much time. These are the expectations in terms of quality, and we wanted to do it at this much of a cost. So those are the toughest challenges that I have faced, because at the end of the day, I think my mind, and I am sure I speak on behalf of the organization, Momentum is all here, is, and knowing you, Balaji, I think this is right up your alley. Most facilitators I know are in it to contribute to the learning of a person, to elevate their minds, to allow them to take a next step on their learning journey. And I think clients as well as facilitators are fairly knowing that a short session cannot dramatically change anything. But still, what we do in these sessions is create an environment that triggers the mind to pursue a journey. I think if that's the expectation, it's very achievable, but to actually see a learning outcome within a very short time period, it's an expectation that sometimes I've had to contend with. I'm probably used to it by now. And to that effect, I've had to set limits with a lot of clients who had those expectations. I have to be real with them and say, this is what we can do. And on occasions that has caused us to maybe lose business as well, because they do speak to other vendors, and these other vendors may promise them a little bit more. And maybe they go with that because they feel that the other vendor can deliver for them. So I think that's probably the toughest challenge I've had to deal with in this field over the last few years. Because any other challenge, whether it be from a content design perspective or from a challenging participant perspective, are challenges that I've truly enjoyed, that have either elevated the design or elevated the learning experience of the group, or elevated my own skills as a facilitator. So this is probably the one that stands out in my mind right now.
So I'm very glad to hear that you do try to set the expectations and let the clients know that what is achievable and what is really not. I think a lot of trainers, when they, at least when they are starting, they find it very difficult to say that upfront, uh, to because they definitely need the project, and all of us definitely need the money to survive. And at the same time, being a trainer also makes you want to be very honest with what is really possible. Right? It's not something where we ourselves can be satisfied by setting an unrealistic expectation. Yeah.
Yes, Balaji. And I kind of learned that the hard way as well, because when I initially joined a consulting business, I was an internal trainer with an organization earlier. And not that there were not that there were only realistic expectations there were unrealistic expectations there too. But when I became a consultant, the pressure to win that business is slightly higher. And I did make that mistake once where I did overpromise, and ultimately we underdelivered. Not that the program was bad; the program was fine, but we had overpromised. So, but my manager, as wise as she is, excuse me, knew that I was overpromising, but let me go ahead. She allowed me to see the impact of that, and
Sure.
and that gave me a beautiful life lesson. So I'm a lot more realistic right now.
So a lesson learned the tough way, but stayed forever. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and hearing a lot of very honest answers in terms of feedback, taking feedback, continuous professional development for trainers, and promising what we can. These are some of the most important points that you covered today. And I am very certain that a lot of trainers who are watching this must have been very happy to hear about these factors and understand some of the things that they must have been wondering about. So, is this how it works, or is it right? Is it wrong? Can I do this or not? And so on. Thank you so much for taking your valuable time to be here. I know that you are a little bit unwell too. In spite of that, you didn't want to cancel, and you showed up for this interview. Thanks a lot. It really, really means a lot to me. Thank you.
Hey, Balaji, thank you for the opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as facilitators, well, if you're going in for a training program, regardless of whether you're running a temperature, have a bad throat or a cough, you're still going to go ahead and do it because you made a commitment, right? So the same applies for any commitment that we give, because we have to lead that life of being able to follow through. Because if we don't, then we cannot expect our participants to, right? Because after training programs, sometimes we give them assignments and we hope that they will follow through and do that. So for me, those are some of the principles that we lead our lives by. And we have to stay true to them. And Balaji, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Some very interesting questions. Thank you for putting me on the spot a little bit. I enjoyed that process. And I look forward to maybe connecting with you later, and hopefully this little nugget of conversation will trigger a few minds to think more expansively as we go along. But Balaji, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for doing this for our community as well. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Vikas. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Balaji. Take care. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.